Hello everyone, how you doing? So today we are going to talk about one of the most well-known people of ancient Greece, a philosopher and the first one who called himself that, astronomer, mathematician, vegetarian and uncompromising bean hater. Today we are going to talk about Pythagoras of Samos. Pythagoras of Samos was born approximately 570 BC in, as his name would imply, Samos, a little island off the coast of Greece. Although basically nothing about his life is certain, it seems to be pretty well established that he was born into a somewhat endowed family. Not exactly endowed with political power, but to think more of a gem engraver and his wife. But instead of focusing on a wife engraver and his gem, let me go back 4 seconds. Basically nothing about his life is certain, and that's a fact. So before I tell you the wildest stories about the triangle guy, please keep the following in mind. There are no written sources that come from Pythagoras himself. Most other ancient philosophers talking about him were either satirical or praised him in a very exaggerated manner. Don't believe me? Well, Heraclitus, a philosopher of the time period, saw in Pythagoras nothing but a common swindler who only deceives those who follow him. While another ancient Greek philosopher, you might have heard of him, Aristotle, said that Pythagoras had a golden thigh, was either an incarnation or the son of Apollo, and he is even believed to have said that if Pythagoras was ever bitten by a venomous snake, he'd just bite it back and kill it. My favorite saying, though, comes from Herodotus, who called him not the most insignificant of the Greek sages. Which is, I guess. However, most sources that tell us about Pythagoras are actually from the Roman period, which begins around 400 years after Pythagoras has died. Anyway, back to Triangle Guy. Pythagoras spent most of his youth, as philosophers often did, traveling and learning about the world. Even though there is much debate about where he learned, I believe it is safe to assume that he had 1 or 2 Greek teachers, traveled to Egypt, and maybe visited the Persians as well during his travels. Some even say he went to the Celts, who taught him how to interpret dreams, which he seemed to do on a regular basis. When he came back from his travels, people were so impressed by what he had accomplished to learn that they assumed that he was taught by the pharaoh himself, or had learned about the secrets of the stars from great Zoroastrian priests, with some accounts even saying that Zoroaster himself taught him. When he returned to Samos, Pythagoras became somewhat of a household name when it comes to teaching, and so he founded what would become known as the semicircle, which was comprised of people who came to learn from him. And while it would be easy to assume that the semicircle was nothing but a bunch of people listening to what Pythagoras had to say, it is a bit more complicated than that. And I'm going to come back to it when we are going to cover his philosophy. When he reached the ripe old age of 40, Pythagoras left Samos and traveled to Croton, where he eventually died under somewhat mysterious circumstances after the Pythagoreans, students of his, got too politically engaged in what was going on there at the time. There are many theories out there on how Pythagoras actually died, one suggesting that he was killed by a student of his, another suggesting that he committed suicide after seeing his students being persecuted, and the third one is him being killed after refusing to cross a fava bean field. Which brings us to his philosophy. Now the first one that I know you're burning to hear is that I tell you that he discovered the Pythagorean theorem. You know, the one with the letters and triangles and such. And why it wouldn't be that far-fetched, after all he took a very keen interest in geometry and numbers and math and such, and his slightly older contemporary Thales already discovered a mathematical theorem. It would only seem fair that he discovers one as well. However, modern historians think it is very unlikely that this theorem came from Pythagoras, as the Egyptians and the Persians already used it in architecture long before he ever set foot into Egypt. It is possible, however, that he picked it up and brought it to Greece. Whether he took credit for it or not, I do not know, but it seems kinda suspicious when we think about what the theorem is called now. That's right, I'm on to you. But what did he do then? Well, for starters, Pythagoras was a very firm believer in metempsychosis, which is the immortality of the soul, meaning he believed that after a human dies, his soul would find another carrier or get born into possibly another body. Divination, prophecy, and interpreting dreams were also things that Pythagoras was apparently very invested in. And maybe you are starting to see what kind of picture I'm painting here. It becomes clear why Pythagoras was such a sketchy person to some people. Divination, interpreting dreams, and prophecies were not all too uncommon to the Greeks, so why are they viewed so negatively in the case of Pythagoras? Well, to see that we have to look at his views that were questionable even to his contemporaries. And those included his odd practices when it came to his group of followers, the Pythagoreans in the semicircle. As there were very specific guidelines Pythagoreans and therefore the semicircle needed to follow. Secrecy, for example. People in the semicircle should not talk with outsiders about what they have learned. Pythagoras himself allegedly only taught and even met with those who had showed loyalty and were long-standing members of the group. And if that sounds like a sect, it's because it basically was one. and even though there are some interesting positives about it, like the inclusion of women in his gatherings, it still came across as very suspect to the public in these times. The Pythagoreans also practiced vegetarianism, which probably traces back to Pythagoras' belief about soul and reincarnation, and were avid believers of various mystical practices, almost all of them having to do with numbers. You see, Pythagoras believed numbers to be the ultimate truth of the universe. Everything could be expressed in numbers, and their relation to each other is defined by them. This belief helped Pythagoras develop a musical theory as well as a very unique way of looking at the cosmos. He was among the first people to hypothesize a spherical Earth and came up with an overview of existing climate zones on the planet. Well, now that we got this out of the way, what about them beans? Apparently, Pythagoras believed that fava beans in particular contained the souls of the dead and should not be eaten, as you would expel your life forces if you do. Anyway, that was it on Pythagoras, a probably very skilled mathematician excelling in geometry, making numbers his god, then becoming one to his followers himself, and eventually dying because he didn't like to fight ghosts. I hope you enjoyed this video and you join me in the next one. Until then, may the gods be with you, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.